Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Aslı Demirgüç-Kunt, the Chief Economist of Europe and Central Asia region in the bank. And this event is part of an e-seminar series that's being organized by the research department to discuss the implications of COVID-19 for development policy. Today, we're going to start discussing the impact of COVID on labor mobility and migration. Obviously, the border closures and economic lockdowns and social distancing had an immediate impact on labor markets and migrants. Now, this has global implications, but it's particularly important for the ECA region, my region. As you know, 1 in every 3 migrants goes to Europe. And intra-regional migration is very high in ECA, at 80%. So 80% of the region's immigrants choose to go to other countries in the region. Now, we worry about disruptions to labor mobility, but migrant workers in the countries are also quite vulnerable themselves. They are at greater risk of contracting the disease because of their living conditions, and they also tend to be more likely to lose their jobs since they often cannot work remotely. And these job losses and income losses lead to a reduction in remittances they send home, with implications for their extended families and for the developing countries. So because of all these vulnerabilities, social protection of migrants is also very important. Now, today we have a very nice lineup of speakers to address these issues. We have first, we're going to start with Frédéric Docquier. He's a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain, and he will be presenting his research on Luxembourg, a country highly reliant on cross-border labor flows. Our second speaker is Michal Rutkowski. He is the Global Director of Social Protection and Jobs in the bank, and he will talk about the policy options available to governments to help migrants and assistance the bank can provide them. Now, after the presentations, we will open up to questions from the audience. Please use either the chat function in WebEx or the chat function in YouTube. So with this, floor is yours, Frédéric.
Okay, thank you very much, Asli. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thanks for inviting me, Chala. It's really a pleasure to take part of this e-seminar series. As you know, I'm not a COVID expert. I would say I'm neither an epidemiologist nor a health economist. But whatever our field of expertise, I would say that this public health crisis is really particularly frightening. It may affect economic behaviors and our economic system through multiple channels, and I would say that it's frightening, but it's also fascinating from a scientific point of view. Of course, as a migration scholar, I'm particularly interested in analyzing how COVID-19 is going to affect the management of migration policies and, let's say, human mobility patterns in general. There might be some supply-side responses. We see today that a lot of people are fearing to travel, but in the medium run, we'll see how this crisis will impact economic development and human development in general in poor countries. So there will be uncertain effect on incentives to emigrate. But I'm mostly concerned by the demand-side responses of this crisis. What I'm fearing is to observe inward-looking attitudes which could translate into increasing migration barriers in the future. So what I would like to do today, in 25 minutes, if I'm not wrong, it's to show that in a country where cross-border workers are necessary, cross-border labor inflows are really vital for the economy, the management of the crisis can be adapted to, let's say, jointly control the disease while sustaining a high level of mobility. And perhaps that some measures that are implemented now in Luxembourg or measures that will be implemented in the coming weeks might be transposed to the global economy to manage, let's say, the international migration phenomenon. So I'm trying to change the slide. Yeah, it works. Yeah, so my speech will be divided in 4 parts, and I will be brief on the 4 parts, 5 parts, sorry, of 4 minutes each, let's say. The first section will be a description of the context, what I'm calling here the Luxembourg exception. The sections 2, 3, and 4 will rely on a very simple model that we have built in Luxembourg to help the Luxembourgish task force manage the COVID crisis, or help the government managing the COVID crisis. And the last section will be a conclusion which, let's say, aims to identify a few very simple lessons that can be learned from the quantitative exercise that we have conducted. So let me start by discussing why Luxembourg is really an exception compared to many high-income countries. So the big question, the bottom line question here is, how will COVID-19 influence the trends, the ongoing trends in the attitudes towards immigration or in the policies towards human mobility in general? These trends are important. So before the COVID crisis, we see that migration has been rising in many countries, many high-income countries. On the graph that you have here, the red curve is the proportion of the foreign-born population in the US, and the blue curve is the proportion of the foreign-born population in Europe. And you see that we started from, let's say, 5 to 6% of migrants in the 60s. We are now around 13 to 14%. So on average, in high-income countries, the share of immigrants has increased from 4.5% to 12.5% over the last 60 years. And you might think that this phenomenon is due to north-north mobility, and especially in Europe due to the Schengen Agreement, but it's not true. When you look at the dashed line or the dashed curve that you have on the graph, you have here the proportion of immigrants in the population, but only immigrants originating from developing states. And you see that the trends are really parallel to the total immigration rates. So we have more and more migrants from developing countries, and this trend, this south-north migration trend, explains almost the totality of the rising share of immigrants in high-income countries. The skill structure of these migrants is very important, and it's quite polarized. So you have a few very high-skilled people, and you have many low-skilled people. And in many countries, maybe with the exceptions of highly selective countries, which have a point-based system, for example, in many countries, in Europe in particular, immigration is decreasing slightly the average level of schooling. And it's perceived by the population as a competition with the low-skilled natives and a source of rising inequality. Also, the literature is much more nuanced than that. And these trends explains why before the crisis, we have seen a surge in right-wing populism, and that's clearly obvious that in the UK, Italy, France, Germany, Austria, Spain, Belgium, not to speak about Trump's dream to build a wall between Mexico and the US, the campaigns of populist parties and leaders has been strongly structured around anti-immigration measures. Okay, so the COVID and the post-COVID times could provide an additional rationale for populist leaders to push for stronger migration restrictions. And Alberto Alesina highlighted this point in a recent papers that he wrote. And it's clear that, as Asli said, during the lockdown, many countries have controlled their borders. So it's difficult to move between or across borders in the current times. And we might fear that in the post-lockdown periods, there will be also increasing restrictions to move, and especially increasing restrictions on migration from countries where the virus has not been eradicated or is not under control. So we might expect more restrictions on cross-border traveling and international migration. And obviously for you guys working at the World Bank, the implication for economic development and the implications for illegal migration pressure will be very important. However, Luxembourg seems to be really an exception in that sense. In Luxembourg, in the pre-COVID period, we have seen that the share of immigrants has increased drastically. We are now reaching a share which is around 45%. The big difference is that almost 90% of these migrants are Europeans, and many of them are high skilled. But in addition, every day in Luxembourg, half of the labor force is crossing the border between Belgium, France, Germany, and Luxembourg, and account for 50% of the labor force. So that means that the nationals, the Luxembourgish, are accounting for something between 25 and 30% of the labor force only. And despite this, we see very modest populist tensions in Luxembourg. So the trends, the pre-COVID trends are very different. And it's probably because these workers, cross-border or migrant workers, are bringing human capital into the country, are generating a lot of complementarities with natives, and they are Europeans, so they share more or less the same culture. So very modest populist tensions in Luxembourg before the crisis. And this reliance, this very heavy reliance on cross-border workers is so important that border controls have been really limited during the lockdown period. Of course, we have air travels which have been under control for the last 6 weeks or so, but cross-border workers have never been prevented to commute, even in the neighboring regions, if the neighboring regions show very heterogeneous infection curves and heterogeneous public health policies. I went to Luxembourg this week, and I had no problem at all to cross the border. I had more problems to come back to my country. So no ban on cross-border mobility, and today time has come to restart the economy, and it's really unthinkable in Luxembourg to restart without cross-border workers. So it doesn't mean that the cross-border issue has no influence on the management of the crisis, but it means that the country has really to adapt to this necessity of having cross-border workers to restart the economy. And this is what I would like to illustrate using a model that combines economic ingredients and epidemiological ingredients that we have built to help the task force managing this crisis. So the results that I'm going to show are extracted from an ongoing work that we are producing now with Mira Wozinski and Joël Machado from Lizer, Michel Ben, I think he is there attending this seminar, Pierre Picard and Tom Haas from the university and from SATEC, and many epidemiologists who are helping us. So this model is super simple. It has only 2 blocks, and the economic block is relying on the input-output table of Luxembourg. So it's a short-run macro model with fixed price, fixed capital stock, fixed potential labor force in each sector. So a very simple model that we have extended by including the time dimension and supply constraints. Time dimension, we account in this model for the delivery time of intermediate inputs. So the model is a weekly structure, and let's say that each iteration of the input-output process is in fact corresponding to 1 week. And the other big difference is that in the standard I/O model, everything is determined by demand. So you have a demand shock, and this demand shock is propagated across sectors and generates this I/O multiplier. But in the lockdown situation, you have something different. There are many sectors that are confined, subject to containment measures, and that are supply constrained, so they cannot respond to the increased demand. And this limits a lot the I/O multiplier, which is a good thing when you have a crisis, and which is a bad thing when you restart the economy. So we injected in this model exogenous, let's say, trade scenarios we account for teleworking. And in this model, when you restart the sector impacts the demand addressed to the other sectors of the economy, and this generates employment changes in all the industries of the country. The other block is the epidemiological block, in which we have a very simple model as well. The SIR model is the simplest one you can find in epidemiology. So it's a SIR model with 16 types of workers. We have 4 regions of residence, those living in Luxembourg, those living in Belgium, in Germany, or in France. And these guys can be of 4 types. We ignore death here because we work on the working age population, and the death rate is very low, but we have susceptible people, so not yet infected people, we have the recovered, and we have the infected, but the infected can be asymptomatic or symptomatic. And this makes a huge difference because if you don't test the workers, the asymptomatic workers keep on showing up every morning on the labor market, and there is a big risk that they contaminate the other workers. And for the symptomatic, it takes a few days before you show the symptoms when you are infectious. So during these few days, they also show up on the labor market every morning and contaminate the others, except if you have massive testing. So basically, you have a SIR model for each sector and for 16 types of people. And clearly, this means that there is a probability of each worker to be infected on the job and outside the labor market. The probability to be infected on the job will depend on the time spent on the job, which is affected by employment, the employment rate, and affected by teleworking, which is affected by the proximity and exposure to disease on the job. And this measure can be affected by social distancing measures, for example, and which is depending also on the proportion of infected workers that you have on the labor market, which depends on the testing policy. All these policy measures are exogenous, and we treat the infection curves in the neighboring regions as exogenous as well. And so this is the model, very simple model with 2 interacting interdependent blocks. Obviously, employment determines the time that people spend on the labor market and the risk of being contaminated there. And when you have contamination and infection, it affects the supply of labor, and so the potential of the economy to recover. Just a few words about the parameterization of the model, and I'm going to be very quick, very fast on that. I want to emphasize that we parameterize the economic block in such a way that we fit perfectly the pre-lockdown period. So we fit the situation in December 2019, but we also obtained leading indicators for the post-lockdown periods coming from surveys. For example, the Chamber of Commerce has some estimates of the decrease in total sales by sector, and also estimates of the proportion of workers in teleworking. And we have also access to administrative data on temporary employment, parental leave, and COVID cases by sector. As far as the epidemiologic block is concerned, we use a SIR model for each sector with a minimum of parameters. The reproduction rate in each sector is affected by an industry fixed effect, which is governed by the proximity indices in the sector, physical proximity between worker and exposure to disease, and a time fixed effect which applies to each sector and which is reflecting increasing social distancing and medical protection measures. And so we fit the evolution of the infection curve in Luxembourg by calibrating the time fixed effect. So that's the model. And with this model, we have first quantified or estimate the effect of the lockdown, the containment measures. Next slide. Yeah, okay. So these are the results that we obtained. So here you have the results of a permanent lockdown scenario. The scenario in which from March 20, Luxembourg is putting some sectors into a lockdown situation, and this lockdown situation persists until the end of the year. It's totally unrealistic, and it's totally outdated already, because we know that some some sectors have restarted, like the construction sector and now the education system, but it's just a benchmark. And you see that if you have a permanent lockdown starting on March 20, before that period, you already have a decrease in GDP, which is due to the crisis in China and then the crisis in Italy. So the deterioration of the global economy translates into a loss of GDP for Luxembourg, which is between 3 and 4%. But then we have this big lockdown shock on March 20, and this shock is reducing output by something like 29%, which is really a big shock. However, we have no clue, we have no idea of what the crisis would have been without the lockdown. It's totally possible that without the lockdown, the infection curve would have peaked at a very high level, a lot of death in the country, a saturation of the emergency services in hospitals, and then under this situation, you could have a crisis which would have been even stronger with lockdown.
2 minutes, please.
Sorry?
2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Okay. So below you have the sharing of this effect by sector, and on the right you have the infection curve in Luxembourg with the symptomatic and asymptomatic. So the curve is peaking by the end of March, and under the permanent lockdown situation, the infection curve would have been close to zero by mid-June. And the black line that you see is the cumulative number of recovered people, which is a sort of measure of people who are immune. And you see that the immunization rate would peak at 3.1% of the population only during the lockdown or under a permanent lockdown, which means that restarting an economy only with the recovered people is totally useless in our context. Okay, so I'm going to skip this slide, which basically show that the trade assumptions that we use, export and imports, have very little effect on the cost of the lockdown. However, teleworking had a very important effect in Luxembourg. If all teleworkers had been employed, the cost in terms of GDP would have been twice as large. And if all teleworkers would have been employed at a workplace, the infection curve would have been 20% higher. Then what we have is the restart of the economy. So I'm going to skip the part in which we restart only the construction sector and only show you the graphs that we have when all sectors are restarted at the same time, assuming that it's happening on June 1st. So on the top, you see the effect on GDP per capita, which goes back to its initial value. So there is here an assumption that there will be a return to normalcy when the lockdown is finished. And on the right, you see that the infection curve will strongly depend on social distancing measures. If social distancing measures do not change after the restart, then the epidemic is under control. But if the reproduction number is multiplied by 2.5 or by 3, you see that there will be a relapse in the infection curve. This is without testing. Now, if you start testing people every week or every day, this is what you have below on the right, the epidemic is really, or the pandemic is really under control as well. But what the government has in mind is testing one shot. So do a test when a massive testing of all sectors, when the sectors are restarted, and that's all. So it's a once-for-all test. And in that case, you see that it works quite well at the beginning, but you have a relapse after June or July, and a new peak, which is a bit attenuated and a bit postponed, but this new peak is there. So there are plenty of ways to avoid that, and we provide recommendations to the government, but I'm going to skip that as well. So a few words about cross-border workers. In case you test only nationals and not cross-border workers, so you assume that cross-border workers could be tested in their origin country. And in fact, Belgium and France are not ready to start massive testing campaigns right now. In that case, testing nationals infrequently is totally equivalent of no testing. So the testing that the government would like to do would have no impact because all cross-border workers would come back and contaminate the system. And below, if the infection curve is out of control in Belgium and France, you see that without testing, once again, the contamination of Luxembourg would be very important and the relapse would be very high. So this really showed that in order to be able to restart the economy, Luxembourg should be ready to test also the cross-border workers who are paid in Luxembourg and who are contributing to the value added in Luxembourg. And I'm reaching now the conclusion. What lesson can we draw from that? So the lesson we drawn from the Luxembourg simulation is that except under very optimistic social distancing measure after the restarting, so if the reproduction rate is below 1, then there is no problem. But except under these very optimistic conditions, restarting with a very small share of infected people at the beginning will generate a rebound in the infection curve. And labor mobility is likely to propagate the rebound if we do nothing. But labor mobility is vital for Luxembourg. So we cannot restart the economy without cross-border workers. So what we learned from the Luxembourgish experience is that during the first peak and the lockdown period, teleworking has played a very important role. It has limited the drop in GDP and limited the peak in the first infection phase. So cross-border mobility and cross-border workers are not an issue if they are tested like nationals. And this is something important. And if you want to transpose that to the global economy, what I would say is that, of course, all high-income countries are going to restart their economic system, and the conditions will be favorable for a relapse. And this relapse can be accelerated if we allow illegal or legal migrants to come from countries where the share of infected is high. So you could say that this is a good argument to close the border. But we also know that migration is vital for least developed countries, which is migration is more and more seen as a development tool. So the two messages that we can learn from Luxembourg is that using teleworking is something that works very well. Maybe we are living a period of globalized capitalism in which there is a race for reducing migration costs and produce intermediate goods in a remote way, and we enter in a new era of digital capitalism. This crisis can be a good opportunity to have a lot of technical progress in digital technologies, and maybe we should exploit that to allow some workers to, and especially high-skilled workers, to work from their country and contribute to the GDP of the country of employment. And the second message is that if the testing is such that new migrants are tested upon arrival to the country and then tested as nationals, you should not fear migration at all. So these are the two messages that I wanted to convey in this very short speech. I would say that, to cite Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. So here, heterogeneity in the country's capacity to control and eradicate the virus is important, but it's not a good reason to reinforce migration barriers. With appropriate testing, you can accommodate, control of the disease with migration. And the second message, as I said, is that by fostering this digital transformation and revolution, by generating learning by doing productivity gains from teleworking, maybe this crisis can be exploited to rethink solutions to make the brain drain or brain circulation even more beneficial for both destination and origin countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. Now we are going to Michal. Michal, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
20 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I may need even more time. Can you see the presentation? I'm trying to share my Microsoft PowerPoint, and I just I'm not sure you see it. Maybe you see it now.
We can
Yes.
see it.
Excellent. Very, very good. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'd like to talk a bit about migration in the context of social protection. And I think it is important for you at the outset to realize that there is an enormous revolution in what the countries do in social protection area, in terms of new programs that are being implemented. You see on the screen that there are 159 countries that had either planned or introduced and administered new social protection measures. And out of those measures, most of those measures are in social assistance or social safety nets. These are synonymous terms which we use in different regions differently because of the muscle memory and culture. But then the action is enormous on the ground, and you see in deep dark blue which countries implemented those. Sorry, I have a difficulty with moving my slides, so I am just trying to see what I can do about that. I seem to be stuck on this slide. Okay, so there are three reasons why migration is so important in the context of COVID responses. And first issue I'd like to raise is the fact that more than on average, migrants tend to live and work in crowded conditions, and social distancing measures, or it should be called physical distancing, but for some reason which I don't understand, it's called social distancing. They are put at increased risk of contracting the disease. And here you have a few important numbers that the one particularly striking are from Singapore and Saudi Arabia, that 40 or 50% of COVID-19 cases come from actually migrants. The second issue is the income loss, because they are more than on average likely to lose as a result of distancing. And again, 30% of workforce is highly affected for foreign workers, 30% are highly affected by in OECD countries. And then finally, the many countries have their social safety net systems constructed in a way in which it's much stronger system in the formal sector than in the informal sector, and very often migrants tend to work in informal jobs. Then there is basically no safety nets existing. As we all know, remittances is a function of migration. So here, income losses translate immediately to decline of remittances. We have a recent report that in which we indicated that remittances to low and middle income countries are dropping at the level of about 20%, and this is the sharpest decline in recent history. For comparison, the drop after the crisis of 2008-9 was 9%, so it's twice as significant. The paradox is that remittances dropped by 20%, but foreign direct investments dropped by 45%. So in fact, the role of remittances in maintaining livelihoods of people will grow, comparatively speaking, because of other transfers are not going to make up for it, or actually falling even faster. I don't think probably to tell you how important a role remittances play as a source of income, but if you look at poorest countries, at 14 countries sub-Saharan Africa, then remittances to GDP, there is in 14 countries it's more than 4%. It's not as extreme as it is in Tonga, when it's 20% of household income, or Nepal or Tajikistan, where it used to be 48% in Nepal and 27 in Tajikistan, but this is a big part of GDP. And I think it's a good moment for me to notice that last year was the first year when the amount of remittances worldwide was bigger than the combined amount on foreign direct investment and overseas development assistance. So this is 2019 is the year to remember about when it comes to a fundamental role of remittances in development. Major closures of borders, you have this awful map of total closures in red in front of you. I can't think about it actually any other way than thinking it's a shame that we have that. That, by the way, Frédéric, includes Polish workers in Western Poland who cannot, in contrast to Luxembourg, to commute to Germany when they usually work, because Poland and Germany close their borders and they cannot cross the border. So they are without jobs in their Western Poland cities, and they cannot go to their work when they are awaited and wanted in Eastern Germany. That's the situation totally opposite to the Luxembourg situation, because you actually told me that from Belgium and France and Germany, you can easily get to Luxembourg to work. Totally different reality on Polish-German border. Let me talk to you briefly about 4 types of programs to address migration-related challenges in the context of COVID-19. And what we are talking here about is, first, we would like, and we support it, to expand eligibility of existing safety net programs to include migrants. Australia comes as a good example with its expanded access to financial assistance to different categories of migrants. We also would like to implement newly created COVID-19 responses. And again, Italy and Ireland here comes as examples, with residence permit holders in Italy that can apply for subsidy, which is used as a tool of reacting to COVID-19. And then Ireland introduced the so-called PUP, Pandemic Unemployment Payment, and they agreed on having migrants totally eligible for receiving the 350 euros. And then there are specific services to migrants in some countries provided to them and helping them to address their challenges. And I mentioned on the slide virus testing and treatment, in a few countries, food and accommodations, transportations, and cash grants. I think when the first port of entry, when you think of COVID-19 reactions, even before we start talking about social safety nets or unemployment benefits, is actually maintaining employment, because we are in a situation in which the transaction costs of letting people go and hiring them after the crisis may be very high. So there is a huge case for wage subsidies, and in many countries we observe lots of reactions on that. And again, there are good examples of countries where wage subsidies are also eligible for migrants: Korea, New Zealand, China. You see it on the upper part of the particular slide. Social insurance contributions, it's very complicated whether we would support it or not. I think the deductions in social insurance contributions as an emergency measure, I think our cutting-edge knowledge is perhaps yes in defined benefit schemes, but not in defined contribution schemes. The fact of the matter is that many countries implement it across the board. And if it's implemented across the board, that we want migrants to be covered. And this is China, Singapore, Saudi Arabia are mentioned because they included the migrants in their programs of deductions in social insurance contributions. And then finally is the issue of regulations and work permits. And then there has been a massive change in several countries. My own country, Poland, is mentioned here because Poland decided to extend work permits across the board to all the Ukrainians working in Poland. It's almost 1 million of them because of agricultural labor needed. But then there are many other countries doing it, and it's actually a very positive reaction. Now, there are 2 options to apply employment promotion policies to migrants, and they are on this slide. The first is job matching and job search programs. And then we have good examples from Australia and China of those. And then we have those adjustments of rules regarding migration programs to facilitate employment. And here, European countries, at least 2 come as good examples, with Germany relaxing travel restrictions to allow seasonal agricultural workers, and Spain announcing that work permits will be provided to young immigrants with residency, which is good. And the same happened in Canada and Vietnam, when exceptions were created to restrictions on international entry to their countries. When it comes to remittances, and I already talked about the shock of remittances, minus 20%, the key issue seems to be, and this is progressing slower than we would wish, that remittance service providers, famous RSPs, are really classified as essential services. If they are, that automatically opens up various avenues of recognizing them. And then what is important is to support the remittances industry with instruments that help in managing that. For remittances, you need to remember that this is the area where in some places, especially in small island economies, the costs are exorbitant, ahead of 20%. The average is 6%. I don't think we have a good grasp of how those costs diverged further in the COVID crisis, but the hypothesis is they might have. But what is key is promoting digital models, support universal financial access, very much enhance delivery systems of payments, and then regulatory capacity is needed, as remittances always come with the risk of money laundering and various other illegal activities. Let me finish by talking to you about three main challenges and two opportunities at this juncture. And the challenges, as we see them, is first, migrants need to be in a position in which they can access social protection programs, and in too many countries, they are excluded from them. Second, actually, it is not easy to identify migrants. So we need to rely more on approaches that include self-targeting and self-employment, because we need self-selection to play a more important role in targeting than visible indicators otherwise, including means testing, proxy means testing, geographical targeting, and others. And the third big challenge is, of course, the delivery mechanisms. Because of physical distancing, we have big issue in how to include public health practices and the migrant circumstances into delivery systems, and that includes health screenings, guidance on how work should be undertaken, and plans for responding if a migrant worker falls ill, as well as accommodations in cases when job losses are there, and distributing benefits may require reliance on digital and mobile transfers, and we are very gung-ho on digitization of payments. We've always been, but the COVID crisis shows how important it is those days. The opportunities, and I said there are two, they are, I divide them into two groups. One is mainstreaming migrants into existing programs, and then going universal, providing protections against income losses to all groups, to simplify, to reduce administrative complexity, and then to make sure migrants can access benefits as quickly as others. But the current situation seems to be giving a particular opportunity for local governments to play its role in the orchestra of assisting people, including assisting migrants. And here, the key issue is that action at the local level is not a replacement of comprehensive responses, but plays a very important supplementary role. And there are examples of Chicago, Minneapolis, Campania in Italy, and Tasmania in Australia there. So finally, what are longer-term impacts of COVID-19 on migration? The slide says, and I say it's uncertain, but let me be more intuitive here than the slide says. I believe that the migration pressures are not going to subside. The main drivers of migration, which is income differential between sending and receiving countries, are not likely to be reduced by the COVID-19 crisis. Demographic trends, the second important factor, are going to remain the same, with aging societies, for instance, in Europe or Northern America, and young societies elsewhere. So my sense is that there will be pressures on migration will be absolutely the same. The problem is, though, that there might be more resistance towards migration for irrational reasons related to COVID-19. And I think Frédéric was very good in describing how you don't need to fear migration when you test and you have a vaccine. But what might happen is that there will be more resistance, and there will be also an attempt to use technological progress to, so to speak, substitute for migrant labor. But on balance, I think that technology is unlikely to completely automate away the need for migrant labor. And I think some countries will actually realize, and maybe Luxembourg is a good example, how they rely on migrant labor. So the regime may be even liberalized in order to allow for it. So I think overall lesson from the COVID-19 crisis is that we need to have systems that really build in migrant-sensitive social protection systems, and distinguishing between domestic population and migrants doesn't make sense anymore. Let me thank you very much, and I really treat it as an honor to be invited to this seminar, Ashley, Jailer, and Mauro. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. Now, so we turn to our audience. Please, I guess you can raise your hand. I'm not sure how I see that, but please use the chat function if you have questions. And I'm getting some questions from the YouTube as well as Ryan sends them to me. So we can collect a couple. I see there's one question about the construction sector, to sort of elaborate perhaps more the impact on the construction sector, but why don't we take a few? Please go ahead.
Good morning. This is Sonia Plaza from...
Yes, Sonia, you can ask your question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question for Docquier. Frédéric, thank you very much for the great model. This is Sonia Plaza from the Nomad meeting. I'm working with Michal very closely on the migration and remittances team. Very happy to see you. One question. Your model is perfect. I wanted to see the solutions is more for developed countries, because testing the cross-border migrants is going to be very difficult in Africa. Intra-regional migration in Africa is 60%, 70%. Even there's not enough testing at the level of the country. So that could be a thing that we have to see what are the real implications, as well as the teleworking for these people, because we need to work more a little bit in the digital skills. So that's a question. How do you see the situation? And not even Africa. Look at the cross-border of Venezuela into my country in Peru, no? The Venezuelans, Colombians, Ecuadorians. We will have a lot of contamination, and as well all the deportees from the United States to Central America. So that's one thing. And then on the questions, 2 points on the remittances. It's going to be a big call for actions. And one of the things we are already seeing progress on establishing essential services for migrants, for remittances, for example, UK. I think that we should concentrate also from the southern states or the developing countries to figure it out what could be the measures really to avoid some of the big impact. And then on the political economy, because some of the measures also, I was in a discussion yesterday, Michal, with Uganda, the social protection, especially for refugees, not so much for migrants, is very, very heavy, heated. So how we can support in the identification and how we can work with them. So Nomad is working a lot on the diaspora and the remittances and the labor mobility. So happy to continue this discussion and the designing and together with Michal. Thank you. Over.
Yes, and one question from YouTube. There is a question to elaborate a bit more on the potential policies, particularly social protection policies for undocumented migrants. So that goes to Michal. So I don't, okay. And another question from our chat function, a question on gender, whether we have information disaggregated by gender, whether male or female migrants are affected more in your view, given potentially, for example, female migrants tend to be less able to work remotely. Perhaps they might be in greater impacted by job losses. So this is a question whether if you have any hard evidence on that. So why don't I turn to you now? You already have a couple of questions. And Frédéric, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understood everything, but I understood that Sonia wanted to have more information about what Luxembourg has done so far. So what I presented, due to the time constraint, is only a scenario in which all the sectors are restarting by June 1st. But in fact, we have many more results in the paper that we are going to produce, and even the slides that I planned to present in front of you today. So we have already started the reopening of the economy in Luxembourg, and indeed we started with the with the construction sector. The message is really the same as for the total restarting. So in the construction sector, which is very important in Luxembourg, the confinement reduced the sales and value added by about 85%. So there was a strong pressure by this sector to restart, but we knew that this is a sector in which you have a lot of physical proximity, and it was a dangerous sector to reopen. So far the sector has been active for 10 days. And what we see, I'm not going to show you the slides, but I'm opening the slides for me. What we see is that when you restart this sector alone, again, everything depends on the way the reproduction rate is going to increase after the restart of the economy. If we have no clue about that. So if the rate of reproduction or the number of the reproduction number of the disease remain relatively low, it's very low today. It's multiplied by 1 or by 2. We will still be below 1. Then the sector will allow to increase the GDP by 5% every week, and the relapse in the curve will not be there because we will be below the reproduction rate of 1 in the economy. However, if the reproduction rate is due to a less physical proximity increases and is multiplied by 3, then there will be a small relapse in the infection curve only due to the restarting of the construction sector. So it's a very good experience to restart with this sector before restarting the rest of the economy. And we clearly show in our simulations that in the worst case scenario, in which the reproduction rate is multiplied by 3 or even more than by 3, we need to test all workers, and to test all workers means testing the Luxembourgish ones and the cross-border ones, and we can do that. And in fact, when you say today high-income countries have the capacity to do this test, while Africa has not this capacity, this is exactly the message that we also convey in Luxembourg. We are persuaded and convinced that in Belgium and in France, for example, contrary perhaps to Germany, where the testing capacity is very large, but in France and Belgium, the government is not ready to test a lot of people in a short period. So we know that the cross-border worker will not be tested in their home country. Just like African potential migrants who would like to come to Europe, they will not be tested before joining Europe. And what we see is that if the country of destination has the capacity to test frequently all these cross-border workers who are contributing to their economy, so it's justified, then there is no relapse in the curve. And we have exactly the same message when we reopen schools or when we reopen the rest of the economy. So we have to adapt the testing policy of Luxembourg to the number of people who will come from abroad. And we know that abroad, the testing capacity is lower. But I find it really normal that if a migrant comes to a country or a cross-border worker comes to Luxembourg to contribute to the value added of the country of destination, to generate complementarities with the natives and bring human capital into the country, that's the responsibility of the destination country to test these guys. And then there is no risk of relapse in the destination. And I don't see why we should stop migration or cross-border mobility in that circumstances. Is there something else you wanted to ask?
Exactly. Thank you very much. You answered my question. Highly appreciated.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia.
Okay, should we go to Michal now? Michal, there were these questions about undocumented migrants and what governments can do to help them. Would you like to pick that one up? And also the gender issue?
This one and the gender one. So undocumented, there was a slide I showed in which how much we commend those countries that do not make any distinction between migrants and non-migrants and between documented and undocumented. And from what we monitor, the situation is spreading. So more and more countries are actually trying to include in social protection systems everybody, legal or illegal, migrant or non-migrant, and we fully support that. And that is actually, given the impossibility of targeting using traditional methods, so you need to go more broadly, more universally to cover urban informal sector. This is perhaps a forced but a welcome policy response. So it goes in the right direction, but still some countries provide distinctions. On gender aspects, which is another question which I think is very interesting and very important, it's actually interesting because most of migrants on major migration corridors are male, and that includes the corridor to the Gulf countries, that includes Mexico to the US, that includes Bangladesh to India. And interestingly, they are in a more volatile situation than women, although women may be medium term in a more difficult one. And one of the ways of looking at it is to compare the construction sector and domestic work. Male dominating the construction sector, and Frédéric was just talking about the fact that construction sector is the first to reopen again. So those males will get back and get their wage and work as migrants, whereas in terms of things like domestic work, the closures or the protection or not having it can last longer. So the sense of the gender differentiation is about volatility, that it may be on balance better for men, and men dominate, but more volatile, whereas for women, it may be a more long-term negative impact with less volatility. And then you need to weigh in the value of volatility versus income. And that's all I can say about that at the moment. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Michal. So there is one more question that I see, and I have a comment myself. Well, the question is, I think, going to Frédéric, who was talking about remote working relationships, migrants actually working remotely from their own countries. So the question has to do with the taxation. Where do you see these people being taxed if they're working in another country and living in their own, and whether this would have implications for brain drain? That's one question. And the other question in my mind, and both of you spoke to this long-term implications of COVID on migration. I mean, we know that even before COVID, over the 1990s, there has been a trend towards deglobalization. You know, trade has been going down, GVCs have been going down, finance has been going down. There were many concerns about the automation and its impact on FDI, reshoring. But despite all these trends, we know that migration had been quite resilient. I mean, it's been more or less 2.5 to 3.5% of population over the last 6 decades. And if anything, it's been increasing in Europe and more concentrated. So do you really think COVID is going to have an impact, or is this going to be just a blimp when we look back in a year or two? So with those, let me go back to my speakers, Frédéric and then Michal, and then we are going to finalize.
Actually, sorry to be rude and come with before Frédéric, but I need to drop off the call in 2 minutes because at 10 a.m. I join another meeting when I am the speaker.
Please go ahead, Dan.
It's going to be a blip. The long-term migration pressures are there, are not they did not subside. So I absolutely believe it's a blip. And then I leave it for Frédéric, and then Mauro Testaverde is on the call as well, who's done a lot of thinking about migration as well. So he could very well represent me in the rest of the meeting. I need to drop off now.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you, Michal. Frédéric, the last word is yours.
Okay, so
you're muted, I think.
and now is it better?
That's fine, yes.
Okay, perfect. Each time I want to unmute myself, I mute myself. So maybe 3 things. I forgot to address the question of the gender, and just one remark about that. So what we do is something which is really macro in the spirit. So we are identifying the sectors that are the most affected by the lockdown and by the crisis, but we would like to collect more data on the occupations or the type of workers within these sectors which will be the most adversely impacted, and we have started doing that. The idea of our project is to identify the most vulnerable part of the population and the part of the labor force in each sector that are affected by the lockdown and by the crisis, and then inject much more precise data on these vulnerable groups into a micro simulations model to predict the effect on inequality and poverty. And we'll really pay attention about the gender aspect when we will do that. So this is the first thing. The second thing, so this is the question about teleworking. Is it encouraged or not, and how is it managed from the fiscal point of view? So yeah, indeed. So teleworking is strongly encouraged because we see that in terms of infection, it plays a beneficial role, and in terms of GDP, when people work from the workplace, they are slightly more productive, but not that much. So the gain from having these guys at the workplace is very small, while the gain in terms of infection is very big. So it's encouraged for sure in Luxembourg, and it does not create any problem from the fiscal point of view, as soon as it's very different from the posted workers situation. The posted worker, you know, these are guys who are paid at the wage of their country of residence. They pay usually the taxes in the country of residence, and they come and spend just a few days or a few months in the country of employment at the workplace. But in Luxembourg, all the cross-border workers are receiving the salary from Luxembourg, and they are paying taxes in Luxembourg and receive benefits from Luxembourg. So this is very different from posted workers in general. And this is maybe why it's also very well perceived, and at least not perceived as social dumping. The only constraint that the neighboring governments are imposing is that because the fiscal treatment is much more beneficial to workers in Luxembourg, cross-border workers are allowed to spend a limited number of days outside Luxembourg during the year. So for example, myself, I'm working in Luxembourg. If I'm living in Belgium, I can only spend 24 days outside of Luxembourg, working outside of Luxembourg. Otherwise, the extra days are taxed in Belgium. And the governments from the neighboring countries have signed an agreement with Luxembourg for teleworking to avoid this rule. So now if we spend 6 months teleworking because of the COVID crisis, we are taxed fully in Luxembourg, and the rule is abandoned, or at least it will be postponed or delayed, which is a very nice thing because we see all the benefits we can derive from Luxembourg. And then the last question that you asked me is, obviously migration is very difficult to control, because as soon as you have this willingness of people to migrate, it's almost impossible to stop them. I remember Chalar in his book on prosperity, migration and prosperity, you know, had this fantastic graph on the migration restrictions from Mexico to the US. And as soon as the restriction appears, you see the legal migration number decreasing and the illegal migration number increasing with almost a perfect substitution. So I don't think that when people are pushed to or incentivized to migrate from very poor countries, and COVID might affect that, might affect economic conditions, human development conditions, violence in some countries, I don't think you can slow down this process. If you prevent them from migrating legally, they will migrate illegally. But this means that the strategy we have in Luxembourg, which consists of testing people when they arrive, is really the best strategy. As soon as they arrive, they receive a test. We should be able to test also the people who migrate illegally. We should be able to identify them. Obviously, we cannot identify all of them, but as soon as some people arrive, we should test them and submit them to the same test as the nationals. And this is the only way to prevent any type of migration to generate this propagation of the virus, what we want to avoid in all our income countries.
Thank you, Frédéric. Now please join me in thanking both of my speakers, and also thank you for attending. This concludes the first half of our seminar on migration. Please also remember to join us for the second half of the seminar series next week at the same time. It's going to feature Müşfik Mübarek from Yale, and Erhan Artuç and Çağlar Özden will also make a presentation. So again, thank you, and this concludes our session. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.